So a few years ago, some of the scientists from around the world got together and performed a kind of an interesting experiment on human nature. So what they did is they took about 25,000 wallets and they put them in over 40 countries around the world. And they strategically placed these wallets like on a street corner or in a busy area, and there's two things in each one of these wallets: a $100 bill and a card telling people how to return the wallet if they found it. So they were kind of basically wanted to see how many people are honest and how many people would not return the wallet, right? And needless to say, these scientists were pretty skeptical, thinking 90% of the people would probably take the money and run. To their shock, the opposite happened. Over 80% of the people returned the wallet and the money. They were shocked. In fact, the guy that was leading the study said he was completely dumbfounded. He thought, well, kind of restores my faith in humanity. Do you know that during COVID, charitable giving increased by over 20%? It's really ironic if you think about the fact that most people were not working at that time and didn't have an income largely to speak of, but it increased by almost 20%. This is why I'm telling you this, because we are told incessantly that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and it's real easy when we hear things day in and day out to think that it is. But the fact is, most people around the world are good people, trying to raise their kids and pay their bills just like everybody else. We never hear about that ever. In fact, many times people assume the negative. It's called negativity bias. Negativity bias. And they often think this is actually good to be this way, because if I'm negative, when the bad stuff happens, well, then I'm prepared. I'm expecting it, not taken off guard. Well, that's a heck of a way to live. Or we can assume that somehow it's going to work out. One of the ways that people fall into negativity bias, or kind of have this dark cloud hanging over them, is by what we call self-pity. Self-pity. Self-pity, which I think we've all kind of fallen into at some point, is kind of a selfish way of navel-gazing, of focusing on myself. One woman that's really a mentor to me, she once said to me, she said, Father Ben, it's not the length of our days that give meaning to our lives, but the depths of our life that give meaning to our life. It's not the length of our lives that give meaning to our lives, but the depth. So I can say on a personal note, if you permit me, I've buried children from St. Jude Hospital that have far more depth in their life than some of the 90-year-old people I've buried. They have depth, not length. And what gives meaning to our life is the depth. Well, how do we do that, Father? Well, I'll tell you one way. Open your eyes. Open your eyes and see the blessings that God has put in front of us. But when people fall into self-pity, they see nothing but themselves. It's myopic. Jesus himself talks about this in Matthew 6:13. This is what he says. He says, they have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they can't hear. He's quoting the Psalms there. And his point is simply to say, look, I've given you so much. So much. Open your eyes. I mean, we're alive another day, folks. The health of your children, the fact that God has given us an income to pay our MLG&W bill, the fact that we're not living on the street. But many times we just don't even think about it, right? Because we're just stressed. And he's like, look, you have eyes, open them. Think about, I've never forgotten you once. And I'm not going to start now. You know, there's 3 forms of self-pity, it said. Number 1, why me? Why is this happening to me? I know all these people that have it all so great. Why is this happening to me? Maybe it's an illness. Maybe it's cancer. Maybe it's the fact that something beyond my control is coming after me and I can't control it. I can't change it. Why is this happening to me? So we fall into self-pity. Number 2, when we feel underappreciated. You know, if I stopped doing this, this whole family would fall apart. This company would fall apart if I wasn't here. This parish would fall apart if I wasn't here. Fill in the blank. Well, you know what? Maybe it needs to. Stop doing it for 2 weeks, see what happens. Maybe it needs to fall apart. So we feel underappreciated for all the stuff we're doing. Finally, one of the ways people fall into self-pity, isolation. What's called social malnutrition. Social malnutrition. They cocoon emotionally and then blame other people for not doing enough to support them. This is why we say in this parish again and again and again, get involved. Get involved. Maybe not here, but someplace. We need other people. We need interaction. You know, I'm not sure if anybody ever here, did anybody here know Father David Knight? Father David Knight? Okay, some of us. So if you're not familiar with Father David Knight, he was a priest in this diocese for over 60 years, died in 2021. And Father David and I were very different, very, very different. As he used to say, Father Ben, you and I live on 2 different theological planets. Anybody that knew Father David knew he tended to lean left politically and theologically. I tend to lean the other way. In fact, we are so different. We once had lunch together at a restaurant, and a parishioner came in who knew both of us and looked at both of us and said simply, "And neither one of you is bleeding?" I mean, we're totally different. Theologically, the only thing Father David and I agreed on is God exists, and it's not us. After that, everything was debatable, right? But Father David and I were good friends. And he and I both spent a lot of time in Guatemala. In fact, he's buried in Guatemala to this day, where he died. So right after I was ordained, a couple years after I was ordained, I had lunch with Father David, and I was going through this bout of self-pity. I was like, he came up to me and he's like, Ben, what's wrong? And I said, David, I'm praying and praying, and I feel like God is just ignoring me. Maybe you felt that way. Like, he's just ignoring me. He's just out to lunch. It's just dry. And I go on for like an hour just telling him all this stuff, and he looks at me and he said, Ben, why don't you take 2 weeks off and go to Guatemala? Go back to your roots. Get out of town. Just disappear. And I was like, you know what? I think I'll do that. So I did. I took 2 weeks off, went to Guatemala, disappeared. I was in this rural village in the mountains in Guatemala, just praying. And so one day I get up early and I'm having my coffee, and I look out over the mountains in this ravine, and I see it looks like little creatures crawling all over the side of these mountains. I was like, what in the world is that? So I go up and I kind of clear my glasses and I'm looking, right? Wasn't creatures at all, it was children. Children. These kids, they looked like they were no older than first, second, or third grade. So this is what they were doing. Each one of them had a rope wrapped around their waist. The rope was tied to a tree, and they were walking backwards down the mountain picking coffee beans. First, second, third grade. Thousands of children that would normally be in school. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, when I was your age, I was playing Atari and listening to Van Halen. Right? Here they are, first grade, second grade, picking coffee beans. If that rope gave way, they would fall down into the ravine. It's a normal day. So I'm talking to this one little girl afterwards. And I'm talking to her. She took the time to make me a rosary out of coffee beans, which I still have. Hit me like a Mack truck. As if the Lord was saying, you know what, Father Ben, you may be going through a time, a bout of self-pity. Open your eyes, my friend, and see what you've been given. I was cured of that pretty quick, I can tell you this. When we fall into self-pity, nothing good comes from this, folks. And what we have to do is open our eyes, see what we've been given in this month dedicated to gratitude, and see the people around us that are often trying to get through to us, that we often filter out. He who has eyes, let him see. He who has ears, let him hear. It's not the length of our lives that will give meaning to our lives. It's the depth of our life that will give meaning to these days that we have.